Due Process, winner of 21 regional Emmy Awards, including the 2010 New York Emmy for our coverage of voting rights and the 2012 Mid-Atlantic Emmys for Outstanding Interview Special and Outstanding Discussion Series. Due Process is a presentation of Rutgers School of Law, Newark, and the Edward J. Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy. Studio facilities provided by the Rutgers ITV Studio, Division of Continuing Studies.
He ends up as the Great Emancipator, no question about it, but he doesn't just get there in a straight line.
That complex relationship between Lincoln and slavery, Eric Foner's Pulitzer-winning masterwork. So who better to mark Lincoln's Great Proclamation 150 years after than Professor Foner, here with fellow historian Clement Price on this Emancipation edition of Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process provided by the Fund for New Jersey, supporting informed citizens for an effective democracy.
Was he truly this country's greatest president? How did he really feel about slavery? Was the Lincoln who first ran for president the same Lincoln who was killed in office? I'm Raymond Brown.
And I'm Sandra King, and this is the year for looking at Lincoln and slavery. 150 years ago, he signed his Great Proclamation, the first step in emancipation. 2 years later, he'd see the 13th Amendment through, an achievement turned cinema, thanks to Steven Spielberg.
We here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
This settles the fate for all coming time, not only of the millions now in bondage, but of unborn millions to come. Shall we stop this bleeding?
But Columbia professor Eric Foner, one of this country's most important historians of slavery and the Civil War, starts his Pulitzer-winning look at Lincoln decades before the 13th Amendment.
He and Rutgers' own Clement Price, Board of Governors Distinguished Professor of History and Director of the university's Institute on Ethnicity, Culture, and the Modern Experience, are here to help us understand how Lincoln became the Great Emancipator and what that meant to this country. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Ray, yes.
Eric, let me start by returning to the Spielberg movie just for a minute. It's a very unambivalent look at Lincoln. It reinforces what we might have learned in school: the great emancipator, the great president, the humanitarian. Read your book and you see a very different Lincoln in the years leading up to that. A Lincoln who had deeply racist attitudes, who thought that emancipation should be a very gradual kind of process, with compensation not to the freed slaves, but to the slave holders, and deportation, mass deportation of black people to wherever would take them. So how do we square these two Lincolns?
Well, I think you can square them by thinking about the theme that really is the core of my book, which is Lincoln's growth, development. Lincoln ends up, I think, in a very different place on these issues than he began. And, you know, my book tries to trace that out. And he dropped the idea of colonizing African Americans outside the country. He dropped the idea of monetary compensation, and of course,
because those weren't practical notions anymore, or because he'd really grown past them?
for many reasons. One is African Americans didn't want to leave the country. They refused. Actually, Lincoln always said it had to be colonization, not deportation. It had to be voluntary, and most blacks did not want to leave. They were Americans. They demanded their rights. So it's the pressure of events, and it's all his own growth intellectually and politically. The movie, as you said, takes one moment in Lincoln's life. You know, it's a good movie. It does very well by Hollywood standards. The acting is excellent, but it doesn't give you any sense of how Lincoln got to that point. As you say, it's the Great Emancipator. It's like he was born with a pen in his hand, ready to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. So it's not history as we understand it. History is the study of change over time.
But one of the things that I think is most fascinating about your book is that you don't fudge it. That is, the evidence that might undermine your conclusion about who he is right there on the page. So even as he signs the Emancipation Proclamation, he's still thinking about colonization.
Oh, absolutely.
And so the question is, when the Great Emancipator signs the Emancipation Proclamation, has emancipation become a first principle, or is it still a matter very much of military necessity and political strategy?
It's all of the above. You know, emancipation is a giant process. It's not just Lincoln. I mean, the problem with the movie is it's so claustrophobic. It's as if just Lincoln and certain members of Congress abolished slavery. The slaves don't play a part in this movie and in the end of slavery, but
Nor do black intellectuals
or virtually
the
any
few
blacks
advisors
as
that
historical
that he had,
actors.
yes.
I think that's a serious problem with the film. But yes, I mean, look, I'm not writing either to defend Lincoln or to condemn Lincoln. I'm trying to show the truth as I see it. Too many books on Lincoln, I'm not going to mention any, but too many books on Lincoln ignore aspects of his life that don't seem to fit the Great Emancipator mold. Certainly his long-term belief in colonization, in encouraging the former slaves to leave the country. You won't find a lot of that in most books. Now, there are some. Lerone Bennett, the black scholar, maybe overemphasizes it. He said, this is the real Lincoln. He really doesn't hate slavery or anything. Lincoln always hated slavery. He said that, and I believe him. But hating slavery doesn't tell you what to do about it. And he tried many different modes. But I think the key to the Emancipation Proclamation is not that it freed all the slaves. It didn't. But that it marks a turning point in the war and in Lincoln's own policy. He's never willing to go back on it, even though by 1864, a lot of people are saying, hey, you know, maybe you should rescind the proclamation. It's politically unwise. It's maybe people think it's prolonging the war. Lincoln says absolutely no. We have made this step and we're going to follow it through. So my view is he kind of grows into the role of the Great Emancipator. He doesn't start there, but he does end up there by the end of the war.
Clem, Eric says very clearly in the book that Lincoln had an aversion to slavery, but how strong could it have been if he was willing to support the Fugitive Slave Act, if he spoke about how impossible it would be to have a post-emancipation world where both black people and white people lived in the same society? How do you square it?
One of my favorite lines from Malcolm X, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, goes like this: if you're south of the Canadian border, you're south. That helps us to contextualize Lincoln within his generation. He was a man born into a slave society in the early 19th century. By the standards of his contemporaries, I understand that he's grappling with an issue that runs deep in the DNA of our society. And as Eric's book, and Eric really has helped us to imagine a man who is evolving. So should we all. And we should evolve in a way that puts us on the right side of history and enable us to make a course correction. If I could just talk a bit about the movie, what is missing in that movie for me? And
You saw it twice. So
I saw it twice.
I don't know if that's because you liked it or because you wanted
that's
to
because
look a little
I'm a
closer.
historian and you look at sources at least twice,
Right.
right? The relationship between Lincoln and Douglas would have helped that movie enormously because
and it doesn't exist in the movie.
It doesn't exist.
Although Eric shows us that meetings took place leading right up to the period that is talked about in the movie.
Well, the problem is they decided to look at just basically 3 weeks of Lincoln's life, and Douglas and Lincoln did not meet in those 3 weeks. But that's a decision which I found rather claustrophobic, you know. And I agree. Douglas, you know, Lincoln and Douglas had two very substantial meetings in 1863 and 64 where they discussed the condition of black soldiers, the fate of slavery, the proclamation. And I think Lincoln, you know, my view is that by engaging with a guy like Douglas, that actually, I think, helps to moderate Lincoln's racial views. He had never met a man like Frederick Douglass out in Illinois. There were very few blacks in Illinois. You know, Illinois, the state he's living in, had a law prohibiting blacks from even entering the state. That's Malcolm X's point, you know. So I think Lincoln grows in office partly out of contact with politically active, articulate people like Douglas, as well as many others. You can name
the challenge, but to get away from Spielberg, but still deal with the modern sensibility issue. It seems to me that not only are you talking about the Great Emancipator in a simple way versus understanding the complexity, but also our view looking backwards as opposed to what might have been a contemporaneous view. I mean, you have the Attorney General talking to Francis Lieber about whether they're citizens months before the Emancipation. And then if citizens, what does it really mean to vote, suffrage, et cetera? So you have attitudes about race and racial inequality that modern people don't associate with a person who could also sign the Emancipation Proclamation.
No, that's exactly right. And people are working out. I think that's an extremely good point. Today, we think we know what citizenship is, although it's somewhat contested for some people. But back then, they're working that out. There is no definition of citizenship. States determine it, and states, for example, in Massachusetts, black men can vote. They have pretty much equality before the law, but in most northern states, blacks are not considered citizens, and they have very few rights. I'm talking about free ones, not just slaves.
Including New Jersey.
Well, New Jersey is one of the most retrograde.
That's where I was going next, perhaps the worst. You point out in the book that New Jersey's the last northern state to outlaw slavery, but Clem has made me aware that there were slaves living in New Jersey at the start of the Civil War.
18 of them.
Which, I mean, how did we wind up so south? You know, Malcolm's admonition to us notwithstanding, there were other places for us to have looked at, and yet New Jersey was and remained right up well into the 20th century, a very southern state.
I think it's the only state, northern state, that Lincoln didn't carry when he ran the second time in 1864.
Right.
But you know, another part of the mythology about Lincoln as opposed to the reality is, and I know, Clem, you're out among the people, even as an intellectual, maybe especially what an intellectual should do, is that how many folks would associate the idea of colonization with Lincoln?
Nobody.
I mean, who, prior certainly to Eric's book, but even now, those who haven't read it yet, and everybody should read it, but that notion as sort of the core hope he has for the solution of this complex racial problem. And yet, at the end of the day, although there are black colonization movements in the 20th century, I mean, the Garvey movement at the time, blacks say no, but how many people would think of that as what was, to Lincoln, a preferred solution for most of his political life?
Probably not many, and all too few Americans realize that colonization was an early remedy by whites to rid the nation of free blacks. In fact, to an extent,
we had Liberia already. Sierra Leone through a more oblique
the colonization movement begins in New Jersey in the early 19th century. What must be put on the table is
Can I ask you one more point thing about that? Because what colonization says is, even though there is either a practical or theoretical opposition to slavery, we can't abide the notion of a biracial society.
Right. They cannot put. Lincoln doesn't really start thinking about America as a biracial society until after the Emancipation Proclamation, because he then drops public advocacy of colonization. He never mentions it again in public, although privately there are still plans going on. One of the major reasons for that, I think, is in the proclamation, for the first time, they invite African American men to join the Union Army, and putting men in the Army is a very different concept than telling them they should leave the country. And I think Lincoln comes to feel that by fighting for the Union, they have staked a claim to citizenship. In fact, in his very last speech, you know, when he talks about some blacks voting in the South, he singles out the soldiers. They have earned the right to vote. Now, that's not universal suffrage, but New Jersey didn't allow blacks to vote. Illinois, Ohio, Pennsylvania, almost no northern states allowed. So when he says the soldiers and the very intelligent, that is free blacks in the South, should vote, he's ahead of the curve by that point. So it shows you something about his evolution on that.
But it's another way of our looking back, because women didn't have the suffrage, and in fact you have a split between suffragists and abolitionists who had been really one and the same until the 15th Amendment. And in New Jersey, Clement, I had interrupted you, Clement, you were about to say about New Jersey.
One of the things that needs to be put on this table, in fact all tables where we talk about Lincoln and slavery and such things, Lincoln has been monumentalized to such an extent he's barely recognizable. Blacks played a role in the monumentalizing of Abraham Lincoln. They seized the man, turned him into the Great Emancipator. I tell my undergraduate students, it seems to me the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement might be the famous Easter's recital on the steps of the Lincoln Monument by Marian Anderson. I mean, Lincoln with that backdrop, this extraordinary American artist who happens to be black, and you jump ahead by the generation, and the monuments of Lincoln is deployed again and again and again. Most recently, I guess, the Million Man March.
And in this grim picture, that was the experience of African Americans from the very beginning. Natural that folks would reach out to have a hero, a savior. However, let's come back to New Jersey, because I'd love you to talk about where New Jersey was. It certainly wasn't a haven for the radicals.
No.
And yet it was part of the Union effort. How did that work?
It's a complicated state then and now. It was tethered to the South by virtue of economic ties, especially Newark, New Jersey, and to an extent Trenton and other old industrial towns. It was a diverse state in terms of European immigrant groups working on becoming white. What better way to become white than to climb or step over a black? What better way to become white than to join the Union Army if you're an Irishman or if you're German? So it's a very white state because of the quest for whiteness, but the group that can't pull that off by dint of circumstance and pigment and culture are the Africans who were here. I might just add that every history student knows the word Copperhead. Well, New Jersey was a Copperhead state. It was in the Union, but it behaved as if it wanted to be somewhere else. There's another lesson here, a geography lesson. Take a look at the map of the Northeast or the Mid-Atlantic states. New Jersey could qualify as a border state.
Oh, the southern part of Jersey is pretty close to slave territory, you know. And of course, this doesn't end with the Civil War. I mean, look at the career of Paul Robeson, who grows up in Princeton, and his father, who I think was a slave, actually.
His father was an escaped slave.
You know, he suffered discrimination all the time in Jersey. So
in fact, the Klan had some activity in my childhood in southern parts of New Jersey.
Indeed.
But using your term, monumentalization, to what extent was your book a conscious effort to say, if we're going to understand Lincoln, you've got to understand him warts and all, or in a more complex way? And if so, do you think you will succeed in starting a serious discussion beyond the people who read your book about this demonumentalization? If that's a
well,
word.
I hope so. I mean, you know, every Lincoln you want is out there in the literature. There is the
Even
great,
the vampire.
there is the vampire, right? There is the great Emancipator. There is the racist. There is the guy with no political views. There is the guy who's just buffeted by events. There's, you know, there's thousands of books about Lincoln. So, you know, I'm not trying to sweep all of those off the table, but I do think, you know, the role of the historian is to call it as you see it.
Which Lincoln do you love, as opposed to getting past your intellectual mantle?
To me,
which
you know,
Lincoln do you love?
I do admire Lincoln, and I admire him precisely because of this capacity to change. And that goes along with intellectual curiosity, a willingness to listen to criticism, things that maybe some of our leaders nowadays could benefit from. You know, Lincoln didn't mind it when people like Douglas came in and said, hey, look, you're really not doing the right thing here, here, and here. The President of the United States could say, hey, I don't need to listen to you, you know, but no, Lincoln listened to critics. He didn't mind the abolitionists, the radicals, sometimes very seriously criticizing him, but he adopted some of their views. So that's what I admire. It's not just, oh, he changed. It's the character, the you know, modesty, intellectual curiosity, which enables you to grow out of earlier views and to get on the side of history, as Clem used that phrase before. So, you know, but that, I'm not trying to put Lincoln up on a pedestal or a monument, but on the other hand, there are books that just try to smash him down. He was a tyrant. He was a racist his whole life. He didn't care about slavery. I think those are far too extreme the other direction.
There's also a book that's come out in the last year or so, not by a historian, but by a law professor, Stephen Carter, which speculates who Lincoln would have been and what would have happened to him had the assassination not been successful, had he lived, and he speculates that the radicals would have impeached him.
That is nonsense, in my humble opinion.
You're right.
I mean, you know, look, we don't know. This is speculation, obviously, or what we call counterfactual history. But as I said, first of all, Lincoln was an extremely astute politician. He was plugged into the Republican Party. He was plugged into Northern public opinion. It's almost inconceivable that he would have gotten so isolated from the North and the Republican Party, as Andrew Johnson, his successor, did, that they would impeach him. Lincoln always worked with Congress. As to the radicals, Lincoln cooperated with them as much as they had conflict. The problem with Carter is he's buying into a much older mythology that the radicals was sort of the evil geniuses of Reconstruction, and if it wasn't for the radicals, everything would have been nice and pleasant. No, that is not true. Southern whites were not trying to be nice and pleasant to the emancipated slaves.
But let's leave Carter's speculations out and talk. There's an interesting piece, however, to writing about Lincoln after, had he been here. The question arises, who would he have been? What would he have been? And how could he and so many other apparently brilliant people who were working through the Civil War, through how you were going to handle emancipation, but never made any plans for what's going to happen post-emancipation to these people who are completely unprepared to be out in the world without a safety net, without any assistance. Clem, how do you figure that just wasn't at the front of everybody's mind, if only for practical reasons?
We must take a look at some of the new scholarship, which is in concert with what Eric has done, and that's paying attention to the blacks. The blacks were forcing the hand of Lincoln during and probably before the Civil War. If you try to situate, they don't have to be at the center, but they need to be at the center of our consciousness that they were there, and whatever they were doing during the war, they continued to do after the war. They continued to try to manipulate contemporary sensibilities that would make them Americans. Lincoln would have had to have dealt with those people, but we don't know how he would have dealt with them. I suspect he would have been a lot more agile and sophisticated than was Johnson. That's easy.
So, Eric, Clem's comment and Sandy's question forced you to end with a minute or so and explain to us, how would Lincoln's growth, the arc that you identify, have continued through the complexity of Reconstruction?
Absolutely, I'm sure it would have. The worst thing you can do is freeze Lincoln and say, okay, he had a plan of Reconstruction at the end of the war, and he would have just carried that through stubbornly. No, he didn't do that at any point in the war. He's always evolving. There's no reason to think he wouldn't have continued to grow. He would have made an arrangement with Congress, which I think would have looked pretty much like what happened in 1866, the Civil Rights Law, the 14th Amendment. Would that have succeeded? I don't know. I think your point is right, Sandra. Nobody was really thinking through what was needed to make freedom a reality for the 4 million former slaves. They were concentrating on the war, winning the war. That was number one in everyone's mind. And it was only when the war was over that people turned to the question of Reconstruction and what freedom would really mean. And, you know, that was a very difficult question. I don't think Lincoln would have solved it all by himself, but
incredibly short-sighted on the
you
part
know, in
of
the middle
everyone
of the most
who was
titanic
looking.
war of the 19th century, it was difficult to think about what would happen after the war. You know, that's not an excuse, but I think you can understand why people were totally focused on winning the war, which is where emancipation comes from. As you said before, Ray, it's a military measure to weaken the Confederacy and help to win the war. On the other hand, as Lincoln says in it, it is also an act of justice. So you have to merge those two things, military necessity, act of justice.
The
As much
last.
as I would like to continue the conversation, Clem, we do have to stop there. It is the end of this edition of Due Process, with our thanks to Professors Eric Foner and Clem Price for the kind of talk that makes due process different.
So we hope you join us next week and every week for more critical questions of law and justice like this. Till then, please visit our website, dueprocesstv.rutgers.edu, for on-demand access to all 17 years of our award-winning program. For Sandy, Associate Producer Tanya Ivanova, and all of us here, I'm Raymond Brown. Thanks for watching.
In some of these books, you get a picture of a Lincoln who never changes. He's born with a pen in his hand, ready to emancipate the slaves, and waits for the right moment. This is totally unhistorical. The problem with that is it doesn't see the trajectory of his history, which is full of detours and maybe false paths. He ends up as the Great Emancipator, no question about it, but he doesn't just get there in a straight line. So that if you take this more traditional view, it's very hard to explain why, for much of his life, he believes that slaves should be freed, but colonized outside the United States. They should go to Haiti, they should go to Central America. He can't really conceptualize the United States as a biracial society of free people until really the last 2 years of his life. But at that time, he does really rethink these questions and moves to a very different position, which I think is much more interesting than to just say, well, he's born with all the right views and that's it throughout his whole life.
Want even more insight on law and justice? Become a fan of Due Process on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and watch us on demand on YouTube.